Dan, thank you for being here.
Thank you for getting me one of those.
I am giving you this.
Thank you.
Well, what an honor to be talking to you on the stage. I want to start off with just an introduction. You have a Michigan connection. Can you tell us what your connection is?
Well, I'm old enough to be a proud Detroiter. I was. I understand the city is not populated with those nowadays, but in my day it was Motor City, Arsenal of Democracy. Born in 1931, I was 10 listening to Pearl Harbor being announced with it. And I was on a pleasure drive with my father in the countryside. He went on to work on, he worked for Albert Kahn in Detroit, structural engineer. And he actually was the chief structural engineer of the Ford Willow Run plant, which was turning out B-24s on an assembly line, which I used to go watch when I was a kid. And I went to school in Highland Park, where we lived, Winona. William E. Barber Public School near the old Ford plant, which was now closed. And then went on a full scholarship to Cranbrook at Bloomfield Hills. And the summer I graduated, 1948, before I went to Harvard, I worked in the Dodge Hamtramck plant, where my hearing has never recovered, actually, from the punch press shop in Hamtramck. And with all that time here, I'd never somehow been to Flint. So when I would have gone anywhere for this event, when Phil Zimbardo asked me, but I was especially interested to come to Flint. Having seen Michael Moore's films, I thought I'd never get to see it.
Right.
So I'm glad to be here.
Well, we're glad you made it, and we're glad Michael Moore didn't turn you off. So can you? I want to start with an introduction. I think Mike maybe alluded to what you've become famous for, but for the audience, there's a lot of people here who have no idea about the Vietnam War. I was born in '73, so it was pretty much done when I was born. I know my father was nearly called up. So I have a slight frame of reference, but a lot of people here don't. So can you give us the Cliff's Notes version of what the Vietnam War was?
Well, it's not only the youngest people here who need reminding about that. I was just reading, as I watched the voting on this act to get us into Syria, the Syrian civil war. The president was pushing just a couple of days ago. And I noticed that the opponents of that were all harking back to Iraq. Rightly so, because what's in store for us, I think, is a replay of the 10 years in war of the Iraq War. But to me, I was very struck that the word Vietnam did not come up in the article, because, of course, these people didn't remember that. I read that 1/3 of the Congress was in Congress when the Iraq War was voted on, in the same way they were voting on this open-ended war. And so 2/3 had no memory of that mistake. But of course, I suppose no one in the Congress, I'd be interested if there were one or two, was there for the Tonkin Gulf resolution in 1964. I was in the Pentagon on my first day by coincidence, having been a consultant earlier, but my first day as a full employee of the Pentagon was August 4th, 1964, and I spent that night watching the progress of the first air raids against North Vietnam in 1964, after an alleged attack that morning, our time, on 2 destroyers in the Tonkin Gulf. And as a result, just like the 2 beheadings that we just saw, and the reaction to that very quickly was, you've got to show them a one-time shot here, very limited, just to show the flag. And we sent 64 sorties over North Vietnam. I was watching their progress. Now, I already knew by that night that everything the president was saying about that occasion was false. I won't go through the whole story now. It's in the first chapter of my book, Secrets. But he said it was unequivocal evidence. I knew the evidence could not have been more thin or equivocal. Like the evidence, if any of you remember, of the WMDs, weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. I think, by the way, I've always believed that Bush and Cheney, President Bush and Cheney, believed there had probably been an attack. WMDs, though there weren't any. But when they said the evidence was unequivocal, that was a lie. We know that at the time. Likewise in Tonkin Gulf, I believe that first night that there probably had been an attack. And I think that the President and Secretary of Defense McNamara, my boss, did believe there probably had been an attack. And when they said unequivocal, false. It could not have been more uncertain and peculiar. And it turned out, as in Iraq, there had been no attack. But those raids that went over then were followed 2 days later, by which time the President knew there had been no attack. On August 7th, by the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which was an open-ended blank check for war, like the Iraq resolution. And that hasn't happened yet. Congress hasn't yet been asked, and may not ever be asked, actually, to endorse any and all actions the President might take, a blank check for war, like the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. Oddly enough, the White House is saying they're going to rely on the blank check that was passed a dozen years ago, right, in 2001 and another one in 2002. Never come back to Congress, maybe. But even at that time, of course, again, I say, in all these cases, they were lied into war. And that's why I'm saying a sense of the history of this is terribly relevant. And it helps to be 83 in this particular case, as I am. And 73, 63 would get you there probably too. But you do have to remember how often this has happened. Well, what followed with that blank check in 64 was the President Joe wanted to drop 4 times as many bombs, tons of bombs, on Indochina as we had dropped in all of World War II. In World War II, we dropped 2 million tons of bombs on Germany, Europe, and Japan, including the enemy. 2 million tons. Johnson, and following him Nixon, dropped 8 million tons of bombs on Indochina alone. And in the course of it, several million Vietnamese were killed and some 58,000 Americans. And there was much more of an anti-war movement at that point because 58,000 Americans is mostly draftees, is that much more, week by week, than the 4,000 killed in Iraq in our earlier war. And so it stayed below the radar. And of course, the President is promising now, right now, that he intends no ground troops, no boots on the ground, only airplanes and drones and aid to the Iraqis. He has also said that our objective, pretty much like Johnson in Vietnam, is to degrade and destroy ISIS in Syria and Iraq. I'm sure there's not one person in the Pentagon who believes that he will achieve, or we will achieve those goals, destroying ISIS with the program he's describing. No boots on the ground. Already the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Dempsey, this time has done what the Joint Chiefs did not do last time when they felt the same. He's publicly come out and in effect challenged the President by saying he will be recommending boots on the ground. And General Odierno, the Chief of Staff of the Army, has said it will not be possible to achieve those objectives without ground troops. Now, I'm sure, as I just said, everyone in the Pentagon agrees with that. Right. But the President keeps saying, I commit, I promise, there will be no ground troops. Now, he has already rejected a proposal to put ground troops on. But in effect, if he were really speaking honestly here, he would be saying, I will reject every recommendation that comes up to me from the Joint Chiefs, which they're already opposing to him. I will always reject it. I will never tell him. And they've said, by the way, they will make the recommendation. If they do, will we hear of it? And if he accepts it secretly, will we hear of it? To go back to Vietnam, the President again said, I will not send American boys to do what Asian boys should be doing. In effect saying no ground troops. What he did right after the election, which I was involved in this as a staff person, was air power. Just air power. No anti-war movement. Well, actually there was an anti-war movement starting even then, but you don't get the casualties with air power. And they used to say in the Pentagon, pilots don't have mothers, by which they meant they're older, they're professionals, they're volunteers, there are few of them, you don't get many casualties, so you don't get an anti-war movement with all the mothers marching. Drones, of course, have no mothers or fathers, so they sound even better. But actually, the 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds did follow, as a matter of fact. And when their mission was changed, and I was in the Pentagon during this, it's in my first book, Papers on the War. When the mission was changed on April 1st, Fool's Day, 1965, to offensive operations from defending the base in Da Nang, where they were supposedly just defending the base which was sending out airplanes, just airplanes. When the mission was changed to offensive operations, meaning we're on the process now of taking the war over from the Vietnamese. George Bundy, the National Security Assistant, wrote a top secret memo saying, the President desires this be handled with as little publicity as possible. The impression is to be given that nothing has been changed here in policy. And contrary to my own expectations, that secret held for months. And later, when the President was sending another 50,000 or 100,000 troops to Vietnam, he was asked, does this mean the mission is changing? The President said, no, there has been no change in the mission, which was technically true because the mission had been changed 4 months earlier, secretly. And the public didn't know that. And I come back to the question right now. General Dempsey has said, if the situation requires it, which it will, that air power is not enough, I will recommend ground troops. I ask again, will we know when he has recommended that? Will we know when the President has changed the mission of those advisors and air supporters? Well, if Obama is much more transparent than Lyndon Johnson, we would know. But he isn't. He promised to be, but he isn't. Right. So, in fact, contrary, Lyndon Johnson indicted no one for, let's put it this way, for a leak. Neither did John F. Kennedy. No president before Richard Nixon had indicted anyone for a leak. I was the first under Richard Nixon when I put out the Pentagon Papers, which was history including this kind of information.
So let's, before we get into the Pentagon Papers and what they were, it's safe to say that as the war progressed, it did start getting unpopular. There was an anti-war movement, and there was very much a divide in the country. Yeah. Phil described it as there were hawks and there were doves, people that were pro-war and anti-war, and there was a lot of aggression, there was a lot of attention, media attention. It was very clear that there was an anti-war movement. And so you, in your position, and maybe you came across these documents, so can you explain what the Pentagon Papers were?
Yes. It was very clear to everybody in the country, I think including in the Pentagon and in Vietnam, that the mission was failing, that it was not succeeding. The Viet Cong were getting stronger year by year, actually. Right. And we were in a stalemate. They weren't able to drive us out to the sea, but we weren't able to find them and destroy them or destroy their popularity. On the contrary, the government we were supporting was so unpopular and had so little support. It was really not capable of attracting popular support, whereas the leaders, most people in Vietnam were not anxious to be under communist leadership. And the NLF, the National Liberation Front, which was fighting against us, supported and commanded really by the government in Hanoi, was led by communists. But they were leading the fight against foreign invaders. And when our airstrikes created great resentment against the foreign occupation, the young men had nowhere to go but to fight under the NLF, into the jungles, and that's what did happen. So our actual operations were strengthening the NLF under its communist leadership year by year, and that was pretty apparent to everyone. But what to do about it? When a new president came in, he said he would end the war, Nixon, at last, with honor, he said. And people thought that meant, well, he'll put some kind of face-saving result on and get us out of there in 6 months or a year. I was working, again, having worked for Johnson, I was in Vietnam, I should say, for 2 years as a volunteer, as a State Department official at that point. When I say volunteer, I'd been in the Pentagon for a year working on the escalation, and then I volunteered to go to Vietnam, and I transferred to the State Department. And my job there was to evaluate pacification, which took me to 38 of the 40 three provinces of Vietnam, and I saw the effects of the war close up. And having been a Marine platoon leader and Marine company commander in peacetime in the 50s, I had the kind of training that allowed me as a civilian to walk with the troops and observe the combat, which I did quite close up in '67 in particular. It was very clear to me how and why we were so stalemated, the extraordinary nationalistic resistance we were encountering. And so, like most people, I think, who were in the government even, I thought this war should end. The idea of escalating it, which some were still in favor, it was clear that by this time we dropped, as I say, by this time maybe 5 million tons of bombs. A couple more million was not going to make a difference. We ought to be out of there, but how to do it? And we were asking what the Pentagon Papers were. McNamara, who had pushed for the escalation, and I think felt responsible for that, rightly so, then was trying to keep a lid on it, but he also recognized it as a failure. And having been, actually, just before he became SecDef, an official of the Ford Motor Company, working in Ann Arbor, he had understood, even earlier at the Harvard Business School, that case studies of past failures were worthwhile. And he wanted to do a case study of the failure in Vietnam. And I worked on that from the beginning. I was one of the first asked to be there because I had worked in the Pentagon on the escalation and then been in Vietnam. I was now at the Rand Corporation as a researcher. In the end, I wrote one of the chapters of that on 1961, drafted it. In the end, it was a 7,000-page top secret study, every page stamped top secret sensitive, titled, it's had various titles, History of U.S. Decision-Making in Vietnam, 1945 to 1968. And it ended in early 68. Sometimes the title is given as 67. But it ended in early 68 because really the people thought then the war was going to end. After the Tet Offensive, it's such a disaster, it's such a stalemate. Even Johnson might end it. Certainly the next president will end it. I continued to work for the government under Nixon as a consultant. And in fact, I wrote Henry Kissinger's first submission to the National Security Council on options in Vietnam. And then I wrote a set of questions for him to give to the bureaucracy, questions for the president to be informed about, to show the degree of uncertainty and the poor prospects that were coming. But I learned that Nixon was going to follow in the footsteps of his predecessors, like the Pentagon Papers. I didn't have documents to prove that, unfortunately. But at that point, I was the only person authorized full possession of the 7,000-page study at Rand to do a lessons learned from Vietnam study in Vietnam for the Defense Department. The only one reading it. And so I learned from those studies that this wasn't just a noble effort gone wrong at the time I came into it in '65, that going back to 1945 and 46, when most Americans didn't dream we were involved in Vietnam at all, more than, by the way, they know we are involved militarily right now in Yemen and Somalia, and really on the level of a war in Iraq, in the Pashtun areas in Iraq, Afghanistan. Most Americans are not aware of that, as a matter of fact, that we're killing people in those countries. Well, who knew that we were involved in 45? But at that point, we were supporting the French to the extent by 49 of 80% of their expenditures, recapturing a former colony that had declared independence. Now, when I read that, and here I am, I've been working on this in the government for years, and in Vietnam, I didn't know that. I didn't know that Vietnamese thought of that war not as a French war as we did, but as a French-American war. They thought of themselves as that America was fighting their independence going back to 45 and 48 and 48, as it was. It's a major part of the perceptions in the war. Almost no American realized that. Well, I thought, this is not a noble cause for an American. We're the first nation born of a war of independence against an empire. We're anti-imperial, I thought. Helping the French regain a colony was not a noble cause. That meant to me that everybody killed in the years since 1945, on both sides really, were killed unjustifiably, unjustified homicide. And that to me spelled murder. It isn't necessarily in international legal terms.
Right.
If you fight in an army, whether you're in a just cause or an unjust cause, a lawyer will not say that you committed murder. But I, as a participant in this, said, to me, I've been involved in a process of mass murder. And that was something that I couldn't just wait for it to end, or hope that it will end gracefully in a few years and not embarrass the United States, as I more or less had done up till then. It was something that should stop as soon as possible. And that put a responsibility on my shoulders, I think, that I hadn't felt earlier than 1969.
And so something clicked. It was clear that the US had no plan to win the war. Is that right, in the documents?
They had no right to win the war, any more than the Japanese in World War II, who had occupied Indochina and left their forts, or the French, who had occupied them for 100 years and left their forts, or the Chinese, who had occupied them for 1,000 years and left their forts. I've never put it just that way before, but the image is in my mind once of driving on a road from Da Nang and seeing one after another these forts, ending with a grassy knoll that was a Chinese fort, 1,000 years old. And I thought, I'm walking in the footsteps of these foreign invaders. Yeah. It was a very eerie thought. In fact, I'll tell you, a kid, I was with a Vietnamese colonel at that point, a kid was yelling, "America, #1, hey, okay," and asking for candy. And I said and the colonel said, when I was a boy, I was out there on the road yelling that sort of thing to foreigners. And I said, "Oh, really? What did you say?" And I thought he was going to say, "Bonjour," to the French. He said, "Ohio," hello in Japanese. And that was an eerie feeling for me, having grown up in the Second World War, that I was dealing with people, that I was walking in the footsteps of Japanese occupiers. So we didn't have a right to be there. We didn't have a right to win, and we weren't going to win. Even as, Hitler committed aggression, some he won, and some he didn't win. He didn't have a right to do any of it. This was Vietnam was not as big as Russia for Hitler, but it was too big for us to win, because in a guerrilla war, we actually, that reassured us. We thought, well, we're not invading China, we're not invading Russia, we're just invading Vietnam. We ought to be able to handle that. It turned out, when it comes to people fighting for their country, nationalistic, in jungles and with open borders, as in Afghanistan, no jungles, but mountains, caves, open borders. When the Russians invaded that, from my experience, I said, they aren't going to have an easy time. They're not going to do it. And they didn't. They left. They were defeated just the way we were essentially defeated in Vietnam, defeated to a stalemate, which we finally left. It was not feasible for us, and I'm saying right now, bring this up to the present. The strategy, first, as General Odierno says, airstrikes and help to locals, such as they are, who that we think may be fighting on our side or may not in Iraq and Syria, is not going to destroy ISIS. It is not going to be successful. Now, there may be military who say, if we do it big enough, if we put enough troops on, then we could succeed, whether we have a right to or not. I would say that's probably wrong. The general said that in Vietnam. If we put enough troops in, we put 550,000. If we put 1 million, then we'd show them, then we'd be successful. I don't think so. 8 million tons? No, do 10 million tons, 15 million tons. I don't think so. We neither were going to succeed, we couldn't, it was infeasible, any more than the French could. Nor did we have a right to it. And whether we have a right or not, that is more murky, definitely, in Iraq and somewhat less so in Syria. But whatever the right is, it's infeasible. It's not going to happen. We're not going to defeat ISIS with military means.
So you used a word a couple of minutes ago, responsibility. So you found yourself in a position where you were the only one who was able to read these documents. And how many pages were there?
7,000.
7,000 pages. And you felt a responsibility. And when people are presented with that opportunity, there are two choices: do nothing or do something. And can you explain why you chose to do something instead of nothing?
Well, they have more than two choices, because of course there is more than one kind of thing you can do.
I'm sure.
And to resist a policy from within, to criticize what the president is doing or challenge it or obstruct it from within in almost any way, write a memo, speak in the water cooler, anything, is somewhat risky.
Yeah.
Makes you a troublemaker, not a team player, and may get your boss in trouble, and that's risky. And so anything has some risk, but there's a great range of possible things you could do. And actually I think I went through pretty much the whole range that I could imagine without taking enormous risks at first. I had a reputation, like a number of other people, for taking the risk of telling what I thought to a boss. And even sometimes, and this is bureaucratically dangerous, but if I thought it was necessary, going around the boss and to a higher level or to a different level. And I'd gotten away with it, you might say, because of what I could contribute up till that point. So I was advising people in the government, inside, higher levels, different levels, as a RAND consultant to the Pentagon. I was telling people like Bobby Kennedy, even later, and that's going outside the executive branch. He was a senator then, but regarded as a presidential hopeful. So I took him, brother of the former president, so I gave him things that I didn't give any other president in terms of classified information and so forth. But going outside the executive branch is a different order of risk, even to Congress. Definitely, because Congress controls the budget, and they're the enemy, you know, in effect. They're the ones who have to be fooled, if possible, and kept out of this process. Well, I did that too. And however, they sat on it, pretty much. I gave the Pentagon Papers initially to Senator Fulbright of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he promised to hold hearings, which is exactly what I wanted. But looking them over, he saw two little problems with that. A, this mainly implicated the Democrats. He was a Democrat, I was a Democrat, because of Kennedy and Johnson, and Truman to start with. And so it made the Democrats look bad. The Democrats never did hold hearings, even though they were in control of the Congress later on this subject. Second, the Pentagon would use that as an excuse no longer to allow him to have classified data. They would say, we can't trust you if you put these out. We'll give foreign military aid to the Armed Services Committee, which is friendly to them, rather than to Senate Foreign Relations. Same thing issue arises now with the intelligence committees. Exactly. Clapper, the head of Director of Central Intelligence, comes before the Senate Intelligence Committee. Supposedly, it's his overseers. Wyden, who knows all the intelligence, knows the answer to the question he asks, are you collecting mass information on masses of Americans of any kind? And Clapper says, under oath, no. Right? Now, some points that haven't been sufficiently brought up. Clapper later, when Snowden reveals that this is totally false, it's a flat lie, because he revealed that's what they're doing, is collecting mass information on essentially everybody. Clapper then says, well, it was the least untruthful answer I could give. And that got some mockery because it had an odd ring to it, you know, sort of unfamiliar phrase, least untruthful. Well, was that truthful or a lie? Well, put it another way, it was the most untruthful answer he could give. What he meant to say was he had chosen not to say yes, which was the truth. Couldn't say that, it was a secret. And he couldn't say what he was supposed to say in such circumstances. Let's go into closed session. I can't answer that in open session. You know, so, because that would hint at the answer that Wyden knew he was lying. Right? And the committee knew he was lying. And in fact, I would even question whether he could be convicted of perjury because he knew that the committee knew the truth. And he wasn't misleading them, he was just misleading the public. The point being, Wyden couldn't do anything with that, didn't do anything with that. He has the lie there, he wanted to bring it out. We don't learn it because Wyden knows it. It's a secret, a black hole. Well, exactly, I gave the documents to the Foreign Relations Committee. That did nothing. He asked to get them formally because he's entitled to get classified information from the Defense Department. They said no, so they didn't come out. The only way that I could bring out this history was to put it out myself through the press, if they would print it, and take the risk and the responsibility, obviously, of doing that. And Fulbright was willing to let me take that risk, all right. And it wouldn't have come out otherwise, just as we would not know the facts that have led to this dozen or more reform bills supposedly going through Congress now about NSA, National Security Agency, if Snowden had not taken the risk of putting out those documents. And what I'm saying, putting out documents is much more risky, but the only way really you can get the truth through, because otherwise they just say, it's a rumor, it's untrue, it's hearsay, and so forth. So unless people are willing to take that risk, that's why just yesterday in Washington, 2 days ago, I was in a press conference calling for whistleblowers right now to put out necessary classified information that would show crimes or deceptions or that the public was being misled as to the nature of the war they were getting into or how large it would be or the costs. If they have estimates, which I'm certain exist, under General Odierno and Dempsey, as to what is called for in the way of divisions in Iraq, not handfuls of troops, or the prospects of success, which are as close to zero as you can get, that should be told to the Congress. And that can't be done without risk, although we're trying to lower the risk by providing a thing called exposed facts, which, like WikiLeaks, will use encryption for sources and try to make it possible to do it anonymously. So you don't have to do what Snowden had to do, which was to go into exile here, essentially.
So and I think we'll get to the Snowden comparison soon. I think it's interesting, we're talking 40 plus years ago, so you had 7,000 pages that you wanted to get to the newspapers. So today you would take it, probably not to Kinko's, but you'd have a machine that could do that pretty quickly. Tell us about your experience.
The Xerox machines in those days were 1 page at a time,
right.
Very slow. And when I saw these later machines, they're just, collate and then rip out, very, very jealous.
So you spent how long you had a piece of paper, you put it on the machine,
altogether
it went
months,
like this.
Months of work. Yeah.
Months of copying these documents.
Working during the day at the Rand Corporation.
And facing that risk every day, knowing that you could be found out at any minute.
Yeah.
And so tell us, walk us through the release. How did you release the papers to the press?
Well, first, as I said, I gave them to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Right. And really, at various times, they considered putting them out in hearings, always dropped away from it. And eventually, I waited too long. But in 71, I first did that in the fall of 69. And then in 71, I gave them to the New York Times. And was also talking to people in Congress. I was hoping for hearings still, so Pete McCloskey and Congress and Senator Mathias and some others. But when the Times brought them out then, they were enjoined for the first time in American history because injunctions, that is prior restraints saying you can't publish, were supposedly banned by the First Amendment. It had never occurred. And that led to then I gave excerpts, as much as I could, to the Washington Post. They were enjoined. Boston Globe, they were enjoined. Eventually the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And then with those 4 injunctions, they kind of gave up on injunctions. And ultimately I gave them to 17 newspapers, which was a mass act of civil disobedience by the newspaper publishers, 17, 19 altogether with the Times. In face of the president, Nixon, saying, this jeopardizes national security, this will damage, hurt, lose American lives, terror, etc. And they read this this material, and they didn't agree. And they defied the Attorney General and the President and went ahead, knowing that they could be prosecuted too. And Nixon did intend to prosecute the New York Times in particular. So there's never been anything like that that I know of in American history, probably any history, of institutions en masse like that defying the government. That's rarely been noted. You know, the attention has been on me, but actually the papers were taking comparable risks. And then I was prosecuted as I'd expected, but I expected that on the false assumption that I was doing civil disobedience, that I was breaking a clear-cut law against putting out classified information. We don't have such a law that was intended by Congress to criminalize the leaking of classified information. Most countries do. And Britain in particular has the Official Secrets Act, which criminalizes any release of classified information. So in Britain, clear-cut violation. We don't have that because of the First Amendment. So what they did, I was the first person ever prosecuted for a leak. It was not the first leak by any means, or the last. But I was prosecuted with this. By the way, when we keep saying 7,000 pages, that was the study. But I didn't give the full 7,000 actually to the newspapers. I gave about 4,000. There were 3,000 on negotiations, and I didn't want to get in the way of negotiations, and I gave those only to the Senate. So the papers had about 4,000, or some subset of that. But I expected, as I say, to be prosecuted, even though I wasn't aware. There had never been a prosecution before. Yeah. And after me, because of the First Amendment, and my case was dropped, we can come to that, there were only 2 others before Obama. Another one which was dropped essentially under Obama, and 1 conviction. The only jury conviction for a leak in 1985. It's 30 years ago. Yeah. President Obama has brought 9 such indictments, 3 times the number of all previous presidents. In history. So the situation has changed. And now people do have to expect. He's using the Espionage Act, which was used against me for the first time, but was not intended to criminalize disclosures to the public. It was intended to criminalize spies giving information to foreigners, and it's used for that all the time, before and after. But he's still using it, as I say, 9 times, as if it were a British Official Secrets Act, which has always been held by Congress, except once, to be unconstitutional under the First Amendment. When I say once, Congress in November 2000 did pass such an act. Clinton vetoed it on the grounds that it was unconstitutional, and hasn't been brought forward since. So I would say I would argue on the basis of a lot of legal scholarship, but still controversial, that act is unconstitutional in this country, violation of the First Amendment, used against disclosures to the American public with no opportunity to defend oneself on the grounds that it served the public interest, which is the way the Espionage Act is written.
And so this action that you took and that the papers took with you essentially ended the war?
Oh, no, by no means. I'm sorry.
Started ending the war.
I'd be glad if that were the case. I scarcely hoped for that. I hoped it would help. After all, it was a history that ended in '68, which is before Nixon came in. Right. So it wasn't what Nixon feared I had, and I did have stuff on Nixon also, but not as much as he feared. And it was because of his fears that I had information about his nuclear threats to North Vietnam, which was how he intended, that was his strategy for winning the war, make nuclear threats. I knew that, and I was sure it would not work, and it didn't. Right. But it never really became that public. There are public sources. But that's what I was trying to avert. But I didn't have documents on it. He feared I did, which led him to take criminal actions, clearly criminal actions, against me to keep my mouth shut. Sent CIA burglars into my former psychoanalyst office, hoping to get information to blackmail me with, to keep me from putting out whatever other documents I might have on him. Then sent a dozen CIA assets up from Miami to Washington to incapacitate me, Ellsberg, totally, on the steps of the Capitol. then a criminal offense. Now, of course, the president is claiming, Obama, the right to do this sort of thing to Americans that he suspects of in various ways. And I was overheard on warrantless wiretaps,
Right.
then illegal.
You just found out about that.
Now legal after the trial.
Yeah.
So when these acts came out as a result of the Watergate break-in, they used the same people for the Watergate break-in. Right. And when one of them finally, people under prosecution, finally revealed the attempt to incapacitate me, the warrantless wiretaps, the burglary, et cetera, et cetera. My trial was ended on the grounds of governmental misconduct against me, a gross pattern. First time that had happened in a federal court, actually. Charges dismissed. So that was a miracle, you know, and that's why I'm sitting here now, in effect. But more importantly, those were key charges in the impeachment hearings against Nixon, which led him to resign. Right. And that, in turn, made the war endable. It ended 9 months after he resigned. And it wouldn't have ended otherwise, actually, would have continued. So the Pentagon Papers, which only dealt up to '68, did not affect Nixon's policy on the war. I'm often given credit for that, too bad, but it didn't. Yeah. It affected public opinion a great deal, but Nixon was paying no attention to public opinion. He was pursuing his war against North Vietnam. He continued to do it. The year after the Pentagon Papers came out, 1972, was the biggest bombing of the war, heavily. And then in '73, the bombing ended. I should say the American troops ended, but we continued to pay the South Vietnamese to bomb. And so forth. And the war went on till '75. So, but what did end the war was Nixon being out of office. Not been my initial goal. Aim. Yeah. And what did that was the actions he took against me to keep me from telling the truth with documents. I was saying what he was doing, but he rightly figured no one would believe me, and that turned out to be true. Right. So that didn't affect him, but in fear that I had documents to prove it, he did these actions against me which brought him down, and that actually did help end the war. So I was part of a chain of actions and events that did help end the war. So that's very good. It shows that one person can have that effect, but that was also true of other people in the chain. John Dean, who revealed to the prosecutors the actions, Alex Butterfield, who revealed the big secret that Nixon had taped himself in the Oval Office, Archibald Cox, who refused the president's order to, or rather I should say, he was the special prosecutor, Elliot Richardson, who refused to fire Archibald Cox, et cetera. There were all these people took unusual action and were part of a chain that ended the war.
So we've got about 3 minutes left. I want to talk about, squeeze the rest of your life into 3 minutes. From what I can gather, that started a different life for you. That you've been, how many times have you been arrested?
About 85.
85 times. And I think that I want you to talk a little bit about that, because the DVD that's for sale out there has got a longer conversation with you and Phil Zimbardo about that lifestyle. And something that you said, I think, struck me, that when you get arrested, it's not an unpleasant experience because you end up hanging out with people that also get arrested, and they're your kind of people. Can you elaborate on that a little?
You meet very, very nice people in jail in connection with civil disobedience actions. I can recommend to you. In fact, well, he didn't eventually marry her. My older son spent 9 years with a woman he met in jail, protesting the nuclear plant in New York. The kind of thing that can happen. I'm trying to advertise this, but the civil disobedience I didn't mention earlier when you were asking me sort of in effect, why did you do this? I would not have thought of doing what I did do, even though I was trying within channels to see the war get ended. But I would not have thought of doing something that would put me in prison for life as I expected. I did face charges of 115 years, 11 felony counts, I think it was. 10 years, 11 for 10 years and 1 for 5. That was it. 115 years, which would have been life, essentially, even with good behavior. if I'd had good behavior, because not everybody was sure I would be a good prisoner.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't have thought of doing that without the face-to-face example of young men who were going to prison, not because they thought they would end the war by doing that, by sitting in a doorway of an induction center or on a railroad track or something, but because it was the most they could do non-violently and truthfully with their lives to end the war, and going to jail for draft resistance. And we don't have the draft as a challenge right now to this, and that is a factor in why we don't have an anti-war movement that we should have had for Iraq or for today. We don't have the casualties, that's good, coming back, but that's because of the reliance on air power in Iraq and Libya and elsewhere. It doesn't do any good to the people on the ground over there, but it saves us from casualties. Okay, so these people were going to prison, and Randy Keeler was the name of one, Bob Eaton, some others that I met face to face, and that put the question in my mind, what can I do to help end this war? A lot of people were doing that, even full time, now that I'm ready to go to prison. And now that I'm ready to, go to prison, that encompasses a lot of other things. So that isn't the choice that most people face. Still, whistleblowing, that is revealing, risking prosecution, which is now a serious risk under Obama and his successors. He's set a precedent here that I'm sure will be followed. That's a very serious consequence, but obviously. But even without that, the risk of losing your clearance, your job, your promotion, your pension, and very likely with a loss of income that's involved, your marriage is very common, your children's education. These are more than sufficient to keep people's mouths shut, even when they realize that what's going on is wrong and should be stopped, and that they could expose it, but only at this cost personally. And unfortunately, what surprised me was to realize that although not in the Marines in peacetime, but in Vietnam as a civilian, I'd seen a great deal of battlefield courage. It's common, routine, everywhere you look, day by day. And yet those same people in a civilian job, like General Powell, who had, former Secretary of State, who'd been a battalion commander in Vietnam, but as Secretary of State, risking his position with the president, risking his clearance and whatever. Neither he nor his assistant, like Larry Wilkerson, who knew that going into Iraq was going to fail and was wrong, clear-cut aggression, knew that, but they couldn't bring themselves to resign. They didn't have the example that I had of meeting people in the anti-war movement. So that example is a crucial aspect. Courage is contagious. And when you see this, that's why I'm so anxious, I'm so hopeful about this project that's going on now to teach people there are times, no, you can't tell any one person, you should change your life here, you should go to prison, you should give up your education, you should do this or that. Nobody can make that decision for anybody else. But I do say to people who have the chance to make a difference by telling the truth, consider paying even a high personal risk if the stakes are high enough, and they may very well be. By the way, here we are in, motor land and so forth, and GM. How many people at GM knew that lives were being risked and lost by that faulty ignition? I'm talking. This is not the government now. Right. Corporations. Well, the answer seems to be hundreds, over perhaps a decade. 19 people we know died, many more that may not have been reported, and so forth. Not one tells the truth to an outsider in that. The Catholic Church, with its abuse, no whistleblowers. Right now, the oil, gas, and coal companies are risking human life on Earth right now. They are denying that because they're funding people who say no climate problem, it's not true, it's not proven, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. My experience in the government tells me, and none in corporations, I am certain those energy companies have studies inside that exactly confirm what is being charged today in New York, isn't it, the march today?
Yep.
in New York and tomorrow and so forth. Everything that's being said by Bill McKibben and James Hansen and others, I'm certain is confirmed 100 times over in studies within the corporations, as was true of the tobacco corporations. No whistleblowers yet. But one person who put those studies out would not risk prosecution. There's no claim of an Official Secrets Act there, but they would risk their jobs. They would risk being blackballed in the industry, perhaps all industry, would not be unserious if they were known. They could save life on Earth. Now, that's a stake that's worth risking your life for. And I understand that this campaign and project and source is precisely to put in people's minds what those people who went to prison put in my minds. It can be worth taking a very great risk, and I, as a human, have that capability.
I think that's a great way to finish. Thank you, Daniel Ellsberg.
The Hero Roundtables are the global events that ask the question, what is a hero? You've just seen one hero talk. To find more and join the conversation, visit our website or social media.